Hi everyone. Today I'm joined with Daniel Friedli, MD and partner at Travel in Motion. Would you like to introduce yourself, Daniel?
Sure, Jessica. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm one of the partners at Travel in Motion. We're a Switzerland-based consulting company, which focuses on airline and airline distribution and a lot of these topics related to the transformation to offer and order and NDC. I've been hanging around the industry since about 1997 in different roles with airlines and with vendors until I founded this company in 2015 together with my partner.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Daniel. So just going straight into it, could you give me an overview of the distribution landscape in Asia?
Sure. I mean, I think Asia's a big area of the world. It's not kind of one overview, right? Especially if we look at China, which is a very different market in a sense, especially now with COVID, than other parts of Asia. Or if we look at parts of Southeast Asia, which has a huge proliferation of low-cost carriers, more so than in other areas. Um, we have countries like Japan who also have low cost carriers, but they're not really low cost in the sense that we would otherwise qualify or quantify low cost carriers. So there's a lot of different areas in Asia that we would almost need to look at. But if I just look at the overall distribution landscape as a whole or from a 20,000-foot level, um, I would say it's progressing but conservative, in a sense that there's not yet maybe as much in terms of bold moves of flag carriers, especially or bigger airline groups, to rattle up the distribution landscape as there has been in Europe. I think there's maybe a higher level of competition through the low cost carriers, which makes it an even bigger challenge for the full service carriers. And I think there's some hesitation on the full service carrier side to, on one hand, meet customer demand of being that full service carrier, and at the same time trying to compete with the pricing policies of the LCCs. And that split is almost getting bigger and bigger. So I think those are some of the key challenges aside from the whole COVID situation, of course.
Course. That's really interesting what you said about Japan not being the traditional sort of low cost carrier. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Well, if we compare the Japanese low cost carriers to, let's say, other ones, say the AirAsia group or many others, Cebu, could be anybody, we see that the other low cost carriers, we can even glance over to Europe and the Wizz Airs and the Ryans, who've really unbundled the product to the max. You get a seat and you sometimes even pay to get into that airplane
Yeah.
to check in. I mean, they've really taken it apart. Whereas if you go to Japan, what you'll see is that a lot of the low cost carriers are actually what we would term a hybrid carrier, because there are things included which typical low costs wouldn't take out. But that's an expectation in the Japanese market. But it's also partially because these low cost carriers are, most of them are owned by the two big flag carriers in the country, and I'm not sure if it's a lack of wanting to compete with themselves or trying to meet a customer expectation, which is potentially a different expectation for the Japanese domestic traveler flying on a low cost carrier than, let's say, for somebody that's going to travel on AirAsia or Cebu Pacific. And so I think they just have a higher expectation that more is in the package.
Okay. Well, yeah, again, that's really interesting because, like you said, Ryanair and those sorts of carriers, um, we see a lot with ancillaries, so like Wizz Air and those airlines. Is that different in Japan if there's sort of more is given in the bundle?
It is. There's a lot less. There's a, or let's say the ancillary market is much smaller, both in terms of variety of types of ancillaries. Even if we just look at things where with some airlines you will pay if you check in at a counter as opposed to checking in online. I'm not sure we would see that in Japan. At least not at this time. Things can develop and things can change. Um, or the seat selection, the baggage. I think there are some things, but never ever to the extent that we see with the whizzes and the others.
Okay, great. So just going back to distribution more broadly now, is this an area in which airlines are slightly hamstrung by legacy systems?
I'm not even sure, Jessica, that it's the legacy systems. I think from at least from our dealings in the past 12, 18 months, in that region, a lot of it is down to contractual situations. Be that their distribution contracts, be that their PSS system contracts, which maybe don't allow them quite the freedom that they would like to implement new or other systems. Um, but I think that the biggest thing holding them back is the lack of freedom to really distribute in the GDS, but also in other channels, and to differentiate content and those kind of things. And I think partly it's because uh, the I think the Asian carriers in some cases are at a bit of a disadvantage in negotiating some of these contracts. It's potentially a language issue, but partially it's also you don't negotiate these contracts every year. It's every few years, and so there's a lack of experience where the other parties they're negotiating multiple contracts like this every single year, so they have a lot more experience, they know what's going on. So I think it's a lot of that. Sure, there are legacy system implications. I mean, let's be honest, there are things that they just can't do because of legacy systems. But that goes again then to, well, could you put something on top of that? And some airlines have. I mean, let's be honest, if we look at an airline like Qantas, who put a solution on top of their PSS to do their merchandising, and others. So there is that possibility. It's just also then a question of how much is it going to cost me to put something on top of my PSS to enable something, and will I get a return on investment?
Okay, yeah, that's great. Um, so looking at this again, this is a hard question because the APAC region is so broad, but how have we seen COVID impact the APAC region and how is this different to the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think the of course the initial impacts were the same, right? I mean, everybody shut down and locked up and threw the key away for a while. Um, I think where we've seen the main difference, and again, I'm going to put China in its own little bucket because China is still in a very different state than even the rest of Asia right now. But we've seen just the reopening of Asia be, in large parts, considerably slower than in, let's say, North America and Europe. Much more careful in terms of how and when do we open things up again. Uh, Again, if I use Japan as an example, we needed a visa to go to Japan up until I think end of September, and PCR tests upon entry, and those restrictions were only just lifted mid-October, where a lot of other parts, especially again Europe and North America, have been much more open, maybe half a year, even three-quarters of a year earlier. In Europe, we were traveling without a lot of certification and PCR tests in early this year already. And I will say, I mean, the other Asian countries did pick up and follow that, but it has been anywhere between 3 and 9 months slower than here, in Europe and in North America. So I think that kind of is the biggest effect, just that lag in reopening.
Yeah. And I guess, like you said, sort of putting China in its slightly separate situation because they're dealing with COVID differently. But then for a lot of these Asian countries, the Chinese market is such a huge part of their tourism that it's hard to separate them in that way.
Well, that is a problem. I mean, that's a commercial problem, especially, and you know, the if we look at both the Japanese tourism, outbound tourism, and the Japanese business, sorry, the Chinese outbound tourism and the Chinese business sector, uh, just the number of tourists that left China into the Asian region for Thailand for swimming or Japan for shopping or beaches in Vietnam. It doesn't matter what you can take any example. That was masses and masses of people because the country is so populous. And at the same time, because China is it's a manufacturing powerhouse, the people from the Asian region or even Europe traveling to China to do business, of course, that's practically gone. I mean, there's very little travel into China for on a business for business occasions. So now, we did hear, China is making its first steps to open up, especially for corporate travel to an extent. Um, but again, I think this is going to have an impact for another half year. It's hard to say, but just yes, it's those massive people that would be spending money on
Yeah.
travel and aren't.
Yeah. And a lot of money at that.
Yes.
So could you explain the transformative impact NDC has had on the distribution industry?
Yeah, it's been interesting because we talk about um, NDC for, or we've been talking about it for quite a while, but I do think that COVID brought a little bit of acceleration. Now, that doesn't mean that it's all of a sudden exploded and everybody's doing NDC and just NDC, but I think that we have seen an acceleration, uh, and we've seen also an increased interest in NDC from airlines which before probably didn't really have it on their radar, or at least not at the top of the priority list, um, especially in that region. So there's quite a few projects going on. There's a lot of airlines looking at what are their options, and there's a lot of airlines in the region who started NDC just before COVID, and then they kind of put it to sleep, and now are looking at it again to reignite the the NDC fire, so to say, I guess, and see what they can do. The interesting thing is that the airlines in Asia who haven't done NDC, now there are some who are quite far along. I mean, um, we'd be wrong to think that um, Asian airlines are not advanced at all. If we look at somebody like Singapore Airlines, I mean, they're very mature. Um, but for a lot of the other airlines, they've kind of been able to look to Europe and to North America to see what has gone well, what hasn't gone well, and take some of the learnings. So I do think that if they can figure out a good value proposition for NDC towards their travel agencies and OTAs, I think we might see a faster pace of adoption if we take the starting point now than we did for the European carriers if we take a starting point 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay. What, if anything, about COVID do you think meant there was a sort of renewed interest in it?
I think part of it was the need or the seeing that we need to drive down cost. So that's one thing, and then to figure out, well, is NDC one way to do it? And it might be, it might not be. I mean, we have to be honest. For some airlines, there's not going to be a cost advantage at all in doing NDC. In fact, it could even be additional cost depending on how your other distribution contracts are. Um, but it's also the prospect of additional revenue, um, the prospect of potentially being able to sell ancillaries that you weren't able to sell before. But I think the biggest prospect is the aspect or the view of I can now control my offer. I can control what am I creating, what am I putting together, at which price, with which ancillaries, and now how I'm going to put that onto my shelf. I mean, that basically the same kind of value proposition we've talked about for a long time, but probably a little bit more realistic to achieve now than it was in let's say 2014 or 15.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So in what ways does NDC uptake vary from region to region?
I think it's fair to say that Europe, and I don't have, statistics or hard fact numbers anywhere, but I think if we just look at the airline activity and what airlines have publicly reported and said, I do think it's fair to say that Europe is probably the highest percentage of NDC sales um, in regard to non-NDC sales on the indirect channel, and probably by a margin. Um, I would say we've got the Americas, or North America after that. I think we're seeing more and more uptake in Central and South America. Uh, with carriers like Copa or Avianca Latam. I think there is slowly getting more traction there. Um, and then we see, if we jump if we jump all the way over to Australia, of course, we have an airline like Qantas, who has been quite vocal about NDC for a few years, and has been doing quite a lot um, to do it. But if we take the overall sort of the Asian region in general, um, I would say it's ahead of Africa, which I think is kind of the least developed in NDC. Um, but it's but Asia is certainly behind Europe and behind North America.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. One order is still in its early stages. How do you think we're going to see this develop in Asia?
Yes, one order is very interesting. I mean, not one order itself and the messages, but the whole concept of the transformation of your PNRs and tickets into an order, and unlocking some of the potential that we're missing or that we can't achieve right now with NDC. I think that's one of the big topics also at some of the industry forums right now. Is we've gotten to a certain stage, and I mean, in our company, we at Travel in Motion, we kind of say NDC 1.0 was up until now. And the NDC 1.0 was, well, let's get the technology in place. Let's figure out how to get the offers out there. Maybe even for some, let's use it as negotiation power. And now we kind of see, now we're in the phase of NDC 2.0. And NDC 2.0 for us, again, these are our terms, but NDC 2.0 is now, let's create value with NDC. Let's make sure we can drive those additional revenues. Let's make sure we can put products out there that the customers want to buy, tailored offers, and use segmentation. But at the same time, I think with NDC 2.0, we're hitting a barrier of, well, now, and goes back to your early question, Jessica, on legacy, is what do we do now with the legacy systems, and can they keep step? And no, they can't really. And so this is where one order comes in, or the whole offer order concept, and the transformation or the transition to order. And we think that this is going to be the biggest topic in the next 1 or 2 years, is this offer order transformation, to see how can we uplift what we have in legacy into the order concept, so we can unlock the rest of the value in NDC.
Okay, that's really interesting. So one to watch for.
Yes, absolutely.
So you've touched on it a little bit already, but if I could ask you to go into a bit more detail, have there been problems transitioning to modern retailing with offer and order technology?
Um, Absolutely. I, I mean, let's be honest. I don't think there's any airline who's really done that transition yet. Um, we hear ambitious goals. Lufthansa is very public about their goals to get to the order transition by, or even before, 2030. They talk about it on stage, and it's an interesting path. But even Lufthansa, with all of the know-how that they have, with the big teams and the resources they have, recognize that it's going to take until 2030, or almost 2030, to do that transformation. Because especially if we get to the order part, the offer part is, some people aren't going to agree with me, but the offer part is almost easy, because there's a lot of solutions out there that already do all kinds of cool stuff with offer. The order, this is really where we get into the guts of replacing things that are in the PSS, so the ticket, or fare basis codes and PNRs, and this is complex because it touches almost every aspect of the airline's commercial business processes, um, payment, accounting, and. So it's we're really working on a transformation that isn't as much of a technology transformation as it is a whole business transformation. But it's also an opportunity. I mean, it's an opportunity, of course, to say, well, let's change that mindset. Let's change who we are as an airline. Let's hopefully simplify some processes, get away from some of the inherent complexity we've built up over 30, 40, 50 years, and move into hopefully a simpler world. But yes, there's lots of problems. Or
Yeah.
it's just the challenges. I mean, if we take simple use cases of, you know, if I have everything in order, well, all of a sudden, none of the current departure control systems will be able to check us in, right? So now we have to think, okay, so what do we have to do to the departure control systems to make sure that we can still be checked in and register our baggage into our order? Uh, but then we have to look at, well, what are all the things that a departure control system does? It doesn't just do check-in, it does all kinds of other things, including interacting with governments to get lists of who can fly and who maybe cannot board and those kind of things. So what effect does it have on that? So it's just all of the downline systems. You know, many airlines, they'll have 200 or 300 systems connecting in and out of a PSS. So either feeding information in or pulling information out. And basically we have to look at every one of those systems and figure out, well, what's going to happen with that?
Yeah. I think that was one of the points that was made quite clear in Amsterdam at World Aviation Festival is that you can't make all these changes. There's not a sort of time where everything stands still and you can do all these updates. You have to be doing it and still functioning and still giving customers what they need.
Yeah, it's a journey, right? It's not a migration from one day to the next. It's a journey, um, and it's the journey is going to be different for every airline because every airline is going to have different challenges, different areas of focusing on. It's going to have different areas where it has enough resources to work on some topics, but not on others. The different surrounding systems, different uh, business focus or vision, different commercial models. So it's going to be different for every airline, and every airline has to build its own transition plans to get from A to Z or from A to B or however far they want to go.
So just looking big picture now, why is it such an important time for the Asian aviation market to meet and discuss challenges in the industry?
Well, I think we're at a point in time now where airlines need to start considering what is next. We know distribution is changing. We talked about it. The type of contracts with the GDSs, for example, are changing. The GDSs are moving forward as well on it from a technology perspective. Um, the the retailing aspect, the customer focus, all of these things are coming into play, and they're all coming in at once from all kinds of different directions. And I think if not about it's maybe not about what can we do right now to change immediately and we have to change something next year, but a lot of it for me is about awareness. I need to be aware of all the things that could change in the next 3, 4, 5, or 8 years, so I don't start putting myself into a situation where I have a let's say a new PSS contract for 10 or for 12 or more years, which won't allow me to go along with the industry change. Or if I have distribution contracts, be that with GDSs or with anybody else, that don't allow me the flexibility to change the models in 2 or 3 years as the industry evolves. So I think it's extremely important that as an industry, we discuss these things not necessarily to make a change right now, but to get a lot of awareness into the market, into the heads of the airline executives, into everybody's minds, so that we don't make a wrong decision now that's going to box us in 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Okay, so getting that sort of informed decision as far as possible, so you're looking long view, not just short term.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Great. And then finally, what are you looking forward to at Aviation Festival Asia?
I think these events are they're a great place, right, to catch up again. Be that to catch up with people that you know and maybe haven't seen, or even if you have seen them, and to discuss, like we are now, what are the problems, what's going on. I think it's exciting to hear the different views and opinions. So I think from a networking perspective, it's excellent. But I also think that it's a place for information, and like we just said before, sharing information. I think there's a lot of people that have a lot to say and a lot of good information to share. And I think there's many, many more people who would love to learn and consume that information and go back home and be able to say, hey, look, this is what we should be looking out for. Hey, have we thought about this? Hey, airline X is doing this. Maybe we should think in that direction. So, I mean, what what better place than an aviation festival, for the region to come together, with global partners as well, and just say, hey, look, this is where we're going. This is what we need to think about. Let's all think about it together.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today. We've packed a lot into 30 minutes.
Yes, that's right. No,
I'll
thank you
just
very much for having me, Jessica.
cool.